Princess Anne has, according to a documented private account circulating within the innermost corridors of the palace, quietly signed the internal papers that will formally withdraw her from the frontline rota of royal duties in order to stand behind the future king. The palace did not tremble because a princess grew tired. It trembled because the one figure who had never once flinched, the one who had absorbed 6 decades of institutional weight without complaint, had chosen, of her own volition, to fold her sword and place it at the feet of her nephew. For those who understand how the monarchy actually functions, this was not a retirement. It was a transfer of gravity. It was the sound of the last unshakable pillar of the old reign stepping sideways, so that the new reign could finally hold its own weight. It was the moment the machinery of succession stopped rehearsing and began in silence to move. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room in which it happened was not grand. It was small, wood-paneled, lit by a single lamp whose shade had yellowed with age, and it held only 3 chairs, though only 2 were used. There were no cameras, there were no aides, there were no witnesses beyond the 2 figures seated across from one another, and the quiet hum of a clock that had measured the hours of far greater constitutional decisions than this one. Princess Anne, in a plain navy jacket without insignia, placed a leather folder on the table between them and did not open it. That folder, in the practical language of the palace, is what senior members carry when they intend to redraw the map of their own duties. She did not speak first. She rarely does. She waited, as she had been trained since childhood to wait, until the silence itself had reached the correct temperature. And when she finally spoke, the sentence she chose was short, unadorned, and irreversible. That mattered because Anne, in the private grammar of the family, never uses ornamental language when a decision has already been made. For William, seated opposite her, the moment did not arrive as relief. It arrived as recognition. He had, through a recorded internal note, preserved by those who managed the schedule of the heir apparent, expected this conversation for months without knowing precisely when it would come. His hands did not move. His face, which has learned in recent years to hold itself very still in front of even the closest observers, betrayed nothing. But behind that stillness, a private calculation began, quiet and precise, of what her withdrawal would mean for the diary of the next 12 months, for the balance of appearances between the older generation and the younger, and for the unspoken question of who now carried the greatest weight of trust inside the family. That mattered because in the architecture of monarchy, trust is not sentiment. Trust is scheduling. Trust is which name appears beside which engagement. And Anne, without saying so, had just handed him the pen. For the king, informed by telephone the following morning through a channel reserved for family matters rather than official ones, the news was received in a manner that those close to him would later describe, through a documented account, as neither surprised nor unhappy, but stilled. He had leaned on his sister for longer than the public had ever been told. He had, during the earliest and most uncertain weeks of his health treatment, relied on her presence in ways that were never briefed, never photographed, and never rehearsed. To lose her from the front line was to lose a form of stability that no press office could replicate. Yet he understood, as she understood, that a monarchy which cannot let its steadiest figures step aside for the next generation is a monarchy that has not truly begun to renew itself. That mattered because renewal, in this house, has never been announced. It has only ever been performed. For the Princess of Wales, watching from a distance she had deliberately kept during a period of her own convalescence, the news carried a different frequency. She had, over the past 2 years, come to understand Anne not as an aunt by marriage, but as a quiet architect of endurance, a woman who had shown her, without lectures, how a public figure survives a private storm. To learn that this same woman was now stepping back specifically to support her husband was to understand that the family had made, without a single press release, a decision about who would carry the future. That mattered because Catherine, more than anyone, knows the cost of that carrying, and knows that Anne would not have moved unless the weight had already begun to shift. For the courtiers, the men and women in dark suits who manage the invisible plumbing of the institution, the news arrived not as emotion but as logistics. Files were reopened. Diaries were pulled from locked drawers. The great grid of the royal year, which is planned in colored blocks 18 months in advance, was quietly redrawn. Certain regiments would need a new colonel-in-chief in ceremonial function. Certain charities, of which Anne is patron in a working rather than titular sense, would need to be gently informed. Certain overseas tours, already penciled in her name, would need to be reassigned. That mattered because in this institution, paper moves before people do. And by the time the public learns of a change, the change has already been engineered in ink. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to a private dinner, held some months earlier at a residence whose name is never printed in official schedules. The table was small. The guests were few. The king was there, though he ate little. The Prince of Wales was there, though he spoke less than usual. And Anne was there, seated at the far end, her posture as upright as it had been at every family gathering for 50 years. It was during that dinner, according to a family memorandum later preserved in the private archive, that the first outline of the current transition was sketched, not on paper, but in the softer medium of implication. The king spoke of the years ahead. William spoke of the years his children would inherit. And Anne, when it was finally her turn, spoke only one sentence about herself. That mattered because in a family trained to speak in code, a single sentence about oneself is the loudest declaration available. She had said, in essence, that she would carry the weight for as long as it was needed, and not 1 hour longer. She had said it without drama, without self-reference, without the softening qualifiers that most people use when they wish to be argued out of a decision. She had said it the way she signs her name, cleanly, without flourish, and with the finality of someone who has already thought the matter through in the private hours before dawn. The king had nodded. William had looked down at his glass, and in that small nod and that small downward glance, a silent contract was formed. That mattered because the great decisions of this family are never made in meetings. They are made in the pauses between courses, in the moments when the staff have withdrawn, in the small human silences that outsiders never see. The confrontation, when it came weeks later, was not a confrontation in the ordinary sense. It was a conversation held standing, in a corridor outside a briefing room, between Anne and one of the senior figures of the household who had come to ask her, respectfully but firmly, to reconsider the scope of what she had proposed. He had arrived with a folder of his own. He had arrived with statistics on engagements per year, on public affection ratings, on the sheer volume of work that Anne alone had absorbed across the calendar. He had arrived, in short, to persuade her that the institution could not afford to lose her. She listened without interrupting. She let him finish every sentence. And when he was done, she said only that she was not leaving the institution. She was making room within it. That mattered because in one sentence she had reframed the entire question, transforming what he had come to describe as a loss into what she intended it to be, an act of construction. He did not argue further. He could not. He had known her long enough to understand that when she chose her verb with that degree of care, the decision was no longer open. He closed his folder. He inclined his head. He turned and walked down the corridor with the slightly slower step of a man who has just watched an era quietly conclude in front of him. That mattered because in this house, the truest confirmations of a shift in power are not announcements but footsteps. The sound of a senior official walking away from a door he can no longer defend. The machinery began to move the following morning. In a small office on an upper floor of the palace, a woman whose title is never given to journalists opened a set of leather-bound diaries and began, page by page, to transfer engagements from one column to another. Anne's name, which had appeared in the ceremonial grid with the consistency of a heartbeat for over 5 decades, began to thin. William's name, and beside it Catherine's when her strength allowed, began to thicken. The change was almost imperceptible at first. A ribbon-cutting reassigned here. A regimental inspection quietly rehomed there. A speech at a charitable gala moved into the future king's diary without fanfare. That mattered because in the physics of the monarchy, The calendar is the true crown. Whoever holds the busiest page holds the future. On a desk in another wing, a small wooden box was opened and its contents redistributed. Inside had been a set of engraved cards used to indicate senior precedents at state functions, cards which, in ordinary times, are moved perhaps once in a decade. 2 of them, bearing Anne's title, were withdrawn from the working set and placed in a velvet-lined drawer used for cards that remain valid but are held in reserve. The drawer closed with a soft, precise sound. That sound, which no member of the public will ever hear, was the true audio signature of the transition. That mattered because objects, in this institution, remember what people are not permitted to say aloud. An empty chair appeared in a briefing that afternoon. It was a chair that Anne had occupied at the end of the long table for as long as any current member of staff could remember. It had not been removed. It had simply been left in place, unoccupied, as a courtesy and as an acknowledgement. Nobody sat in it. Nobody suggested that anyone should. The meeting proceeded, the papers were read, the decisions were taken, and the chair remained empty throughout. That mattered because a chair left empty on purpose is not absence. It is presence in a new form. It is the institution paying its quiet respects, while continuing as it must, to function. The second warning arrived at the end of that same week, in the form of a note handed to William by an aide whose face had lost its usual composure. The note contained no crisis. The note contained, instead, a list. A list of the engagements Anne had already undertaken in the current quarter, cross-referenced with those she had declined for the quarter ahead. And beside each declined engagement a small handwritten annotation in her own hand indicating who, in her judgment, should now be asked to undertake it. William read the list slowly. He read it twice. He understood, before he reached the final line, that this was not a withdrawal. This was a handover. And a handover, in the language of this family, is a document more binding than any public statement, because it is authored not by press officers, but by the person who has decided to relinquish what she once held. That mattered because Anne had not only chosen to step back, she had chosen, with the precision of a strategist, exactly what she was placing in his hands. There was a private moment, unrecorded and unwitnessed except by the 2 figures within it, that occurred on the evening after the list was received. William walked, alone, to a small drawing room in which his aunt had asked to speak with him briefly. He did not bring an aide. He did not bring a folder. He arrived as a nephew, not as a Prince of Wales, and she received him as an aunt, not as the Princess Royal. The titles were left at the door. The room contained a single lamp, 2 armchairs, and the framed photograph of a horse that had won a competition long before either of them had inherited their current burdens. They sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. When she finally spoke, she did not speak of the institution. She spoke of his father. She spoke of his mother, in a phrasing so restrained that anyone else would have missed the tenderness inside it. She spoke of his wife, and of what it would cost her, and of what it had already cost her, and of what Catherine would need in the years ahead that no aid could provide. She spoke of his children, and of the specific promise that was implicit in raising them inside these walls. And then, at the very end, she spoke of him. She told him, through a private account later relayed with his tacit permission, that she had watched him grow into the weight, and that she now believed he could carry it, and that her stepping back was not a farewell but a form of trust, made visible. That mattered because in this family, trust is almost never spoken aloud, and when it is, it functions as a coronation more real than any ceremony. He did not reply immediately. He looked for a long moment at the photograph of the horse. He looked at the small lamp. He looked at the hands of his aunt, which had held reins and dispatch boxes and hospital railings, and the shoulders of grieving strangers for over half a century, and he understood, without needing to say so, that those hands were now, in effect, placing themselves quietly behind his own. When he spoke, he said only 2 sentences. Neither has been reported. Neither will be. That mattered because some sentences, in the private grammar of the monarchy, are meant to be kept and not repeated. Outside, the country did not yet know. The morning that followed carried the ordinary weather of ordinary news. Traffic moved. Markets opened. Broadcasters cued their usual segments. And then, at a moment chosen with the surgical care of a palace that has learned across generations exactly how to release news, a short statement appeared. It did not use the word retirement. It did not use the word step down. It used instead the older, quieter language of adjustment, of support, of focus on the work of the Prince and Princess of Wales. That mattered because the palace speaks in a dialect in which the softest words carry the sharpest meanings, and every reader who understood that dialect understood, within seconds, what had actually occurred. Outside the gates, small crowds began to gather. They did not gather in celebration. They did not gather in protest. They gathered in the older, quieter mode of a public that senses, without being told, that something structural has shifted. A woman in her 70s stood near the railings and did not speak for a long time. When a broadcaster's microphone reached her, she said only that she had grown up watching Anne work, that she had never once seen her complain, and that if Anne had decided the time had come, then the time had come. Her voice broke on the last word, though she did not weep. She simply turned and walked away, her handbag held tightly, her coat buttoned against a wind that had not yet arrived. That mattered because the public reaction to this house is rarely measured in headlines. It is measured in small, upright figures walking away from railings, carrying feelings they cannot fully name. A young man beside her, perhaps 30, said that he had not paid attention to the royal family for most of his life, but that his mother had always said Anne was the one who worked. He said it plainly, without embellishment, in the manner of someone repeating a truth passed down at a kitchen table. He added, after a pause, that if she was stepping back to help William, then William must be ready. Or, if not ready, then close enough to ready that the woman who had watched him grow up believed he could hold it. That mattered because in the private psychology of the country, William's legitimacy has never been in question, but his readiness has always been the quieter debate. And Anne's decision, translated into ordinary language on an ordinary street, functioned as the answer. By the following morning, the front pages had chosen their framings. One broadsheet led with a single word above her photograph, a word that carried within it the accumulated respect of decades. Another paper printed the image of Anne and William walking side by side at an engagement from earlier in the year, with a headline that spoke of a torch being passed. A tabloid, more restrained than usual, chose a portrait of Anne alone, in her plain navy jacket, and printed beneath it a caption that used the phrase, "the one who never stopped." That phrase, in the ordinary vernacular of the country, was as close to a state honor as the popular press ever awards. That mattered, because when the tabloids soften, the nation has already made up its mind. Broadcasters, who often struggle to find the correct register for moments of quiet constitutional gravity, settled on a phrase that would be repeated across the day. They described it, one after another, as an act of service by stepping aside. The phrase was not accidental. It had been chosen, refined, and quietly circulated by figures who understood that the country needed a way to hold two ideas at once, that Anne was doing less, and that Anne was, in doing less, performing the greatest act of duty available to her. That mattered because language in these moments is not decoration. Language is the scaffolding on which the public builds its understanding of what has actually happened. Inside the palace, the day proceeded with the disciplined ordinariness that these walls impose upon extraordinary events. Corridors were walked, papers were signed. A junior member of staff, passing the door of the small wood-paneled room where the original conversation had taken place, paused for a moment without knowing quite why, and then walked on. The folder that had sat between Anne and William that evening had been removed. The lamp had been turned off. The two chairs had been restored to their usual position. Nothing in the room bore any visible evidence that a rain had, in effect, quietly inhaled and prepared to exhale differently. That mattered because this house has always preferred that history leave no fingerprints on the furniture. In a stable some distance from the palace, in a place Anne had always preferred to any stateroom, a horse she had ridden for years was brought out into the morning light. She stood beside it for a long moment before mounting. She placed one hand on its neck, and the animal, sensing something it could not name, held perfectly still. That gesture, small and unwitnessed except by a groom who has served her for 2 decades, was the truest private confirmation of what had occurred. She had not stepped back because she was tired. She had stepped back because she had decided that her remaining energy would be spent in a different geometry, closer to William, closer to Catherine, closer to the working parts of the future rather than the ceremonial weight of the past. That mattered because Anne has always defined duty, not by visibility but by usefulness, and usefulness, in this new season, wore a different face. There was, in the days that followed, a small and almost invisible reshaping of the working rhythm of the family. William's diary thickened, as expected, but in a manner that was carefully paced, so that the public did not perceive a sudden acceleration. Catherine's schedule remained protected, held gently by hands that understood the fragility of recovery. The king's engagements continued at the tempo his treatment allowed. And Anne, though absent from the front line in the traditional sense, appeared instead in the quieter margins, at briefings, at private visits, at the shoulder of William when the moment required a form of presence that only she could provide. She had not disappeared. She had simply reorganized the map of her own gravity. That mattered because gravity, when reorganized well, holds more than it did before. There was one moment, captured briefly by a lens that did not fully understand what it had captured, in which Anne stood a step behind William at a working engagement outside London. She did not speak. She did not step forward. She stood, hands lightly clasped, at exactly the distance that a senior figure occupies when she wishes to signal that the person in front of her is now the principal. Photographers pressed against the barrier saw the composition without decoding it. A single columnist, later that week, decoded it in one sentence. She wrote that Anne had, in that photograph, performed the entire meaning of her decision without moving. That mattered because in the language of royal photography, position is doctrine, and Anne had just written a new page of it, with the placement of her feet. The displaced insiders, those figures whose own influence had depended on the older configuration of the family, understood, more quickly than the public, what had shifted. Certain names, whose access had once been guaranteed by proximity to the Princess Royal, discovered that their calls were now returned more slowly. Certain aides, whose careers had been built around the rhythms of her office, began, without instruction, to update their own maps of where the true weight of the institution now sat. There was no purge, there was no announcement. There was only the slow, inevitable recalibration that happens in any court when the center of gravity moves, and every seasoned figure knows to move with it, or be left standing beside a chair that no longer matters. That mattered because in this institution, survival is not loyalty to a person. Survival is fluency in gravity. There was also, in the outer ring of the family, a quieter reaction that has not yet been widely reported. Those members of the extended royal circle who have, in recent years, drifted further from the working core understood, in the language of the calendar and the seating charts, that Anne's decision would not create room for their return. If anything, it closed it. She had chosen William. She had chosen Catherine. She had chosen the future the king had set in motion when he made clear, in his earliest weeks upon the throne, that the institution would be leaner, more focused, and more visibly earned. Anne's withdrawal was not an opening. It was a narrowing. It was the institution folding inward around the figures it intended to protect. That mattered because a monarchy that narrows well is a monarchy that intends to endure, and every distant relative reading the front pages understood, in the quiet privacy of their own homes, exactly which side of that narrowing they now stood on. The one figure who spoke the least, and yet whose presence shaped the entire arrangement, was Catherine. She had, through a documented private account, expressed to Anne earlier in the year a gratitude so restrained that it might have been mistaken for formality, had it not been for the small, specific detail she added at the end. She had thanked Anne not for the public duties Anne had shouldered during her recovery, but for the private ones, for the phone calls that carried no agenda, for the visits that carried no photographers, for the presence that carried no expectation. That, in the vocabulary of this family, is the deepest form of thanks, because it acknowledges the work that no one else will ever see. That mattered because Anne's decision to step back specifically to support William was, in truth, also a decision to protect Catherine. And Catherine, more than any camera could show, understood exactly what she had been given. For William, the days that followed carried a particular texture. He was seen at engagements, standing slightly straighter than before, though not in a way that anyone could photograph. He was heard in the recordings of his public remarks, choosing his verbs with a fraction more care. He was, in private, according to a recorded internal note, spending longer in the small study where he prepares for his weekly briefings, reading not only the papers of the day, but the older papers of the reigns before his, as if measuring himself against the shape of the work, rather than the noise of the coverage. That mattered because a future king who begins to study the shape of the work, rather than the noise of the coverage, is a future king who has understood the weight of what has just been placed in his hands. There was a moment, late in the week, when he passed a portrait in a corridor of one of the residences, a portrait of his grandmother in early middle age, standing with a quiet, unassuming steadiness that his aunt had inherited more visibly than anyone else in the family. He paused. He looked at it for a long moment. He said nothing. He walked on. That mattered because in the private iconography of this house, the resemblance between his grandmother and his aunt has always been the resemblance the family speaks of least and understands most. To have Anne step back at this precise moment was, in a sense, to receive a continuity that the country itself had not yet realized it was witnessing. The final scene, if this transition can be said to have one, took place not in a stateroom, not in a briefing, not in a corridor, but at the entrance of a small country church that Anne had attended for years without fanfare. She arrived as she always does on time. She wore as she always does, clothing chosen for weather rather than photograph. She entered, as she always does, without ceremony. Inside, in a pew near the front, she sat quietly for the length of the service. She listened. She sang the hymns without ornament. And afterwards, on the small gravel path that led back to the road, she paused for a moment to speak to a woman she had known for years. A woman with no title, no office, no political weight, whose only relationship to the Princess Royal was one of long acquaintance. They spoke for perhaps 2 minutes. Nobody recorded the words. That mattered because Anne, in this new season, has already begun to understand that the truest measure of the work ahead will not be spoken in palaces. It will be spoken on gravel paths, to women without titles, in the small human currency that this family, at its best, has always known how to spend. Somewhere in the same hour, in a different residence, William stood at a window and looked out at a garden he had known since childhood. He held a cup of tea that had gone cold. He was thinking, according to a documented private account, not of the years ahead in the abstract, but of the specific decisions of the specific week to come. He was thinking of the diary his aunt had, in effect, redrawn for him. He was thinking of his wife and of the pace she required. He was thinking of his father, and of the strength his father was still, quietly, choosing to spend. And he was thinking of Anne, of the plain navy jacket, of the leather folder that had never been opened, of the sentence she had spoken in the small wood-paneled room, of the way she had stood a step behind him at that engagement outside London, without speaking, without moving, without asking to be seen. That mattered because a future king who carries such images in his private memory is a future king who has been given, without ceremony, the deepest inheritance the institution can offer, the inheritance of example. Anne gave the family honesty. William gave the country readiness. Catherine gave the future patience. The king gave the reign continuity. And the institution, which so often speaks in the loudest possible register, gave on this occasion the rarest gift available to it, the gift of silence used well. It did not shout the change. It did not stage the change. It allowed the change to move through its corridors at the pace of its oldest instincts. And by the time the country understood what had happened, the country understood also that it had happened correctly. That mattered because a monarchy that changes correctly does not need to persuade anyone that it has changed. It only needs to continue. And the continuation itself becomes the argument. The Princess Royal will still be seen. She will still be present. She will still, when required, appear at the shoulder of her nephew, with the quiet, unornamented steadiness that has defined her for over half a century. But the front line, in the sense the country has understood it for decades, now belongs to the next generation. And the woman who could most credibly have refused to relinquish it has instead chosen, of her own accord, to place it in their hands. That is not a diminishment. That is the highest form of service this house has ever known, the service of stepping aside so that the future can begin to hold its own weight, in its own time, under its own name. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.